Hello, I'm Jenny Larkins in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. Welcome to the Administration Code training. In addition to the PowerPoint slides and notes, we'll reference these two documents during our training: the Administration Code for Kentucky's Educational Assessment Program 703 KAR 5:080 and the Administration Code Check for Understanding document that corresponds with the question checks in this video presentation. Before we begin, let's talk about why we have an administration code. Kentucky law requires us to implement a statewide balanced assessment system. That system allows us to inform the public of how our schools are performing and to inform parents of how their children are performing. It drives our school improvement efforts. It helps us ensure equity in our education program. The information we collect from state assessments is used locally and at the state level to make very important decisions. And the only way that we can provide that information with confidence is if we know that our assessment system is implemented with fidelity and uniformity. The Administration Code details the standardized assessment practices necessary to ensure that our system of assessment is being administered in the same manner in every school across the state. The Administration Code regulation describes practices that are considered appropriate for preparing students for the assessments, for administering the assessments, and for keeping test materials secure and confidential. When the Administration Code was being developed, the standards used in determining the appropriate practices were professional ethics, meaning adults are making ethical decisions about students in regard to testing; educational defensibility, meaning that all test prep and administration practices are being conducted for the purpose of student learning and not as an attempt to artificially increase test scores; and finally, student ownership, meaning that all test work is being completed entirely by the student without any coaching or manipulating from adults. The Administration Code is the authoritative source for appropriate test practices, and it's expected that test administrators read it in its entirety as part of the training. However, simply handing someone a copy of the Administration Code and saying, "Here, read this," is not sufficient. In addition to reading the document, training participants need to receive training from a Building Assessment Coordinator, or BAC, or a District Assessment Coordinator, DAC, in a setting where they're able to ask questions and hear examples and scenarios. BACs and DACs may use this video or locally created materials. As we progress through the slides, you'll notice page numbers on the sections of the slides. The page numbers correlate with the Administration Code document. For example, on this slide, the sentence "signature page must be signed" is followed by page number 4. That indicates that more detailed information on that topic is found on page 4 of the Administration Code. Each year, any person with the potential to be involved with any component of testing must be trained on the Administration Code regulation prior to beginning the work. Anyone involved in providing accommodations to students must also receive training in the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation. Part of a test administrator's training also includes reading the Test Administration Manuals, or TAMs, for each test that you'll be administering. The DAC-BAC manual and the Test Administration Manuals are to be the guiding documents for test administration procedures. They should be distributed in advance of any testing so that test administrators can read them in their entirety. That's even by teachers who've been test administrators for several years. It's not enough simply to read through the script on test day. The TAMs are updated every year, and sometimes changes are made that affect test administration. Also, each type of assessment is a little different than the others. For example, students might be allowed to use scratch paper on the high school end of course exams, yet using scratch paper on the college admissions exam could be prohibited. So this is the kind of detailed information found in the TAMs and why we ask that you read those in their entirety. At the completion of required training, participants must sign either an individual or group signature page to be kept on file with the BAC or DAC. You can find the individual signature sheet at the back of the Administration Code document. If BACs prefer it, there is a group signature sheet located on the KDE website, and you see that here on the slide. When signing either of these signature sheets, you are acknowledging that you are being held professionally accountable for your actions and behaviors involving testing. Anyone who will be handling test materials in any manner must also sign a non-disclosure form each year, and that includes technology staff working with online testing. Signing this form means that you agree not to reveal any test content information you might gain by having access to test materials. Non-disclosure of secure test information includes not discussing or sharing specifics with others, even if they have been trained and are participating in test administration. Before we start with test security, take a moment to look over the questions in the first box of your Check Your Understanding sheet. Test security is a national concern, and Kentucky is continually updating our security practices and requirements. So why is test security such a priority to us? Well, first of all, we always want to protect student data. Also, we want to protect the integrity and trustworthiness of our assessment system so that our results are trustworthy. And there are financial considerations. It's a very expensive and lengthy process to write new test items, and we want to be good stewards of taxpayer funds. So who is responsible for test security? Test security should be a top priority of anyone and everyone involved in any aspect of testing. Your building assessment coordinator should have solid processes for ensuring test security at every point along the way, and then everyone should faithfully follow that process. There should be a chain of custody documentation of materials in place, because if materials go missing, we're going to want to know the name of each person who handled or had access to the materials at any point after they arrived in your district. Most allegations are not a result of intentional wrongdoing. They occur because there was not a solid process in place or because a process wasn't followed correctly. Now let's get into some detail about test security. Test security involves keeping test materials safely stored and accounted for, but it also includes keeping our test content confidential. For the most part, our state assessments are developed based on the Kentucky academic standards, so of course teachers are going to know the standards that are being assessed. However, teachers shouldn't be trying to gain information about specific test items. It's expected that test administrators will be scanning students' booklets to make sure students are working in the correct section, but you're looking to see that students are working, not looking to see students work. If you're hovering over students, attempting to read test items or student responses in detail, that is not allowed. Taking notes or taking pictures of test items, discussing test items, sharing information about test items in any manner is not acceptable. Any sort of behavior that's intended to help you gain knowledge of the test content in order to prepare students for this year's assessment or for one in the future is a violation of the administration code. But what if you're scanning a student's work and you notice something alarming, something that might alert you to a problem a student's having, such as abuse or illegal drug use or maybe thoughts of suicide, or a warning that a student might be thinking of doing something dangerous or harmful to others? In those cases, you should report that to your BAC immediately. We prefer, in that case, for the BAC or DAC to make any copies needed for the administrators or the authorities, but those copies are still considered secure test materials, so anyone who receives them should sign a non-disclosure form, and once the situation is resolved, the copies should be destroyed. We've discussed that test administrators should have the TAMs prior to testing windows, but it's not acceptable for them to receive student test booklets prior to the first scheduled day of testing. In fact, no one should have a test booklet at all without the authorization of the DAC or BAC. Test materials are to be kept locked at all times when they aren't being used by students or being prepared for testing or shipping. Most of the time, test booklets are not stored in classrooms, but if a BAC chooses to allow that, then the materials in a classroom must be double locked, which means a locked storage container or file cabinet inside of the locked classroom. Materials aren't required to be double locked in the counselor's or principal's office, but they should never be left unattended when the room is unlocked, and there should be a very limited number of authorized people with access to that area. In general, it's not acceptable to take test materials out of the school building. If you need to bubble in demographic information, you should complete that at the school. On the other hand, being at home or in the hospital doesn't necessarily exempt a student from testing. And in those cases, the test materials would need to be transported to a home or hospital setting. Test security measures are just as important in those situations. It's not acceptable to leave materials with students or to leave them in an unlocked car or anywhere that can be considered a risk to test security. Test security also applies to technology. Some students use technology to respond to test items, such as the constructed response questions on a non-standard response template. Those responses can be saved to CDs or flash drives, but only temporarily. They're not to be saved onto servers or hard drives. After all testing is complete and responses have been printed for scoring, then the responses should be permanently deleted. It's also not acceptable to allow students to transport digital or paper test materials away from the testing area unless they are being supervised. Occasionally, you might receive a request from someone outside the school environment, usually that's a parent, who wants to see their student's test, or maybe they're concerned that a test item is offensive in a cultural or religious manner. And a request like this does contain a test security consideration. So if you do receive such a request, just contact our office and we can help you address that. Part of the responsibility of the Office of Assessment and Accountability is to monitor for test security. As part of that, we receive information from our test vendors who use data forensics, such as erasure analysis, to help identify potential inappropriate practices or at times to exonerate people who have been suspected or accused of inappropriate practices. In addition to that, each year, staff from our office will visit schools during the spring testing window. Some of these visits are purposeful because of a report or accusation, but most of the sites we visit are decided by a computer-generated random selection. We'll contact your DAC about 30 minutes before we arrive to let him or her know that we're on our way. When we show up, we'll interview school and district staff. We'll ask you to describe the processes you have in place to ensure test security. We'll ask you what kind of training your testing staff has had. We'll ask to see your storage and testing areas, and we'll ask you for some specific documents, such as seating charts and test schedules. The purpose of our visits is to monitor test security and to ensure that we have a strong statewide program. The visits also help us determine where training needs to be focused, and they give us opportunity to see all of the great things you're doing. However, while we're there, any situation that's found to violate the administration code will have to be reported as an allegation. Now it's time to check our understanding of test security. Is it acceptable to take photos of test items for use next year so that you know you're teaching the correct content? No, it's not. It's never okay to reproduce test items in any manner, including taking pictures. And we're not supposed to be looking at test content for the purpose of gaining information about how to prepare students for testing. Is it acceptable for teachers to receive test administration manuals prior to the first day of testing? Yes, it is acceptable. In fact, it is expected so that teachers can become familiar with the test administration practices. Is it acceptable to read only the bold type instruction script in the TAMs and skip the test administrator directions if you've been a test administrator in previous years? No, it's not acceptable. Test administration manuals are updated each year, and sometimes the changes that are made affect the new test administration, so they should be read in their entirety each year. Now take a look at the questions for administration practices so that you can listen for the answers in this section. DACs and BACs are the authorities in your schools and districts when dealing with state-required assessment. They're responsible for scheduling the test, for training staff, for assigning staff to test administrations, and for managing rosters and test materials. They're responsible for test security at all points along the assessment program, but this topic is highlighted to remind us that test security is everyone's responsibility. Active monitoring is an important part of a successful test administration. Active monitoring means being engaged in the testing environment while students are working on the test by walking about the room, paying close attention to students' actions and behaviors. If you see students working in the wrong area, helping them get back on track and into the right area. Active monitoring is expected during a test administration. Checking emails, grading papers, texting, reading, and those kinds of activities wouldn't permit active monitoring, so they are not acceptable. Testing environments must be of adequate size and setup to allow for active monitoring. If you are testing in an arena-style setting, you want to make sure that you have plenty of monitors. If you're testing in a small classroom, you need to make sure that the desks are spread apart and giving you enough room to walk between the students as they're testing to see what's going on. Usually, extra proctors are required when monitoring in an online testing environment. A large part of test administration is ensuring a standardized testing environment where no student is given a testing advantage over other students in the state who are testing. Test administrators must be careful not to influence a student's responses in any manner. It's in our nature as educators to help students when they ask for it, but during testing, you may need to suspend some actions that you routinely do during your normal instruction. It is acceptable to advise students as a whole class before the testing begins and at the 5-minute warning to double check their work, look for items they may have forgotten to answer, mark answers clearly by completely filling in the circle, those kinds of things. However, coaching students, editing responses, pointing out missing answers or mistakes to individual students, or giving any kind of evaluative feedback is not acceptable. For example, telling a student that her constructed response isn't long enough would be evaluative, and it would not be acceptable. Remember that student ownership is one of the standards of appropriate test practices. And at no time is anyone to alter student answers. Doing that can lead to sanctions by the Education Professional Standards Board, which could result in losing a teaching certificate. Many test sessions have built-in break times. If time allows, refreshment breaks are acceptable, but all test materials should be collected first and students should be monitored at all times. The same applies to a group restroom break. All test materials should be collected first and students should be monitored at all times. No student should be left alone with test materials at any time. We know that students shouldn't be allowed to move around the room during a test session, but what if you have a student who doesn't always follow directions like that? Or maybe a student you have has outbursts that are pretty predictable. Well, you do not have to wait for a student to be disruptive to make arrangements to test him in a different location. If you have a student who frequently causes disruption, you can make arrangements for that student to test separately from her peers. You can have a plan in place for that student, even if the student does not have an IEP or other program services plan. If a student misses a section of the test due to a legitimate excused absence, the BAC may schedule the student for a makeup session. Remember that test security and administration protocols still apply during makeup sessions. As we discussed earlier, the test administration manuals are to be followed explicitly. They will include specific administration directions and time limits you'll be expected to adhere to. If a student has to leave or stop testing for some reason during a timed assessment, the test administrator should note the balance of time remaining for the student. For example, if a student becomes ill 30 minutes into a 45-minute test, the student will have 15 minutes to work on that section, and that section only, during a makeup session. The student should begin with the first unanswered item and not return to questions in that section that have already been answered, or they should not work on any other section. If a student happens to leave a test session without approval or for some unwarranted reason, such as they simply didn't return after a restroom break, that student may not finish the test part being administered at the time she left. Each assessment has time limits to follow according to the test administration manuals. Well, we have some students who are given extra or extended time to complete the test, but only students with an IEP, 504 plan, or a program services plan can receive extended time. Students who do not receive extended time as part of a service plan should not receive additional time for testing, Even if they've been working diligently throughout the test session and they just have a few more questions to answer, when the time is up, their time is up. So the amount of extended time allowed should be in accordance with a student's IEP, their 504 plan, or PSP. The student's program is either going to reflect time, time and a half, or double time. Any extended time that's provided to that student needs to begin immediately at the completion of the initial test administration, not after lunch or a significant break of any kind or the following day, right after the initial test. Sometimes the need to provide extended time or other accommodations requires additional personnel, and it's acceptable in those cases to change the test schedule for those students. That does not mean changing the order of the test. So in other words, it would be acceptable to have an accommodated student take Math Part B after lunch today, even though her peers took Math Part B this morning. But it would not be acceptable for the accommodated student to take Math Part B today and then Math Part A tomorrow. As we discussed with the students receiving accommodations, all test sections should be administered in the order in which they appear in the test booklets. The order can't be altered to make allowances for lack of resources such as calculators. The only exception to this is during makeup sessions. The expectation is that the student test with their peers whenever possible. So for example, if you have a student who misses reading Part A on Monday and returns to school on Tuesday, if the students were scheduled for reading Part B on Tuesday, the student would test with her peers on reading Part B and then complete reading Part A at a later time during a makeup session. Some state assessments include resource sheets or rulers that are to be used with certain parts of the test. If additional materials are included with your test materials, they must be provided to students and used according to the directions in the test administration manuals. The materials must not be altered in any way. You may not add formulas to the reference sheets or modify the rulers somehow. If you have rulers or reference sheets from previous year's testing, you can use those for classroom instruction, but do not use them on the current year's state test. You may use only the materials that are provided with the current year's test. The students may choose to not use the materials that are provided, but you must make the materials available to them. Occasionally, a student might report a concern to you about a test item or an answer choice. How do you handle that situation? Well, first of all, you do not write it down. You don't make a copy. You don't take a picture of the test item in any way. You identify the possible or actual error and summarize it in a very general, generic manner that wouldn't reveal confidential test content. And an example is here on the slide. Report that summarized error to your BAC, who will notify the DAC and who will then notify our office. Some students will test with accommodations. Principals should work with BACs and special education staff to make sure everyone understands how to accurately provide accommodations. Accommodations are to give students access, not advantage. Any accommodations used during testing should be consistent with what regularly happens in the classroom. For example, if a student hasn't used audio CDs throughout the school year, testing time shouldn't be his first attempt at using them. Accommodations cannot be provided in a manner that may interfere with or influence other students. For example, scribing for students requires you to listen to that student's oral response, so you wouldn't be able to scribe for 2 students at the same time. We've covered a lot of material for administration practices. Let's check our understanding. Is it acceptable to indicate to a student the appropriate work area in a test booklet or student response booklet after a testing session has begun? Yes, it is. Of course, we want students working in the correct testing area, so it is okay to correct them. Is it acceptable to point out to a student that he probably hasn't written enough for a constructed response? No, that is not acceptable. We don't want to take student ownership from the student. And it's also an evaluative comment. We don't want to do that. Is it acceptable to allow a student a few more minutes beyond stop time to finish an exam if she's been working diligently? No, it is not. Students who do not have extended time accommodations on an IEP 504 plan or program services plan do not receive additional testing time. Now take a minute to review your classroom materials questions. We mentioned earlier that students should not be given any materials during testing that are not listed in the test administration manuals. Manipulatives and other items can be available to a student if they are included in the student's IEP or other service plan. They should be easily accessible. The student can't leave the testing area to go retrieve them. Students can be given scratch paper for most assessments, but again, make sure you determine that by reading the test administration manuals. A classroom set of dictionaries and thesaurus should be available for students to use on the on-demand writing assessments only. Again, test administrators should refer to the current test administration manuals for a listing of the approved and unapproved or prohibited materials. When students are finished with a testing session, they are allowed to have non-content related materials after their test materials have been collected. This is a local decision. Some schools decide to do that, some don't. So check with your BAC if you have any questions about that. Students are allowed access to approved calculators if the assessment allows for it. Some assessments allow for calculator use on just certain sections of an assessment. Again, the TAMs are going to be the authority for that, your guidance for that. They will always include a calculator policy and instructions on which sections you can use a calculator on. KDE recommends that schools provide calculators for each student, as long as the calculator meets the current acceptable use criteria. Students are allowed to use their own calculators, but teachers need to check those to make sure they meet the criteria. With either scenario, students within the same testing session may not share calculators, even if the test administrator clears the program between uses. Test administrators are responsible for ensuring that communication and internet capabilities are disabled during testing sessions. Except in cases where it's allowed, such as the online testing, students should not have access to electronic devices during testing sessions. In some schools, BACs or principals might request that teachers use their personal cell phones to notify the office of a need in the classroom. So maybe a student is ill during testing and needs an escort. However, during test administrations, teachers should not be using their cell phones to communicate with other teachers or for personal reasons. In general, during testing sessions, materials containing academic content information or strategies for solving problems must be covered or removed. Basic periodic tables, the U.S. flag, non-content or motivational materials are acceptable and they don't need to be removed. But again, check with your BAC if you have any questions. Materials that are appropriate for instruction and that we've displayed throughout the year may not be appropriate during testing sessions. Posters and charts that contain content material, problem-solving strategies, processes, and so on are not acceptable for display in the testing environment. Well, what is a testing environment? Well, the testing environment is any area that can be seen, heard, or accessed by a student during a testing session. That includes on students' desks, classroom walls, bulletin boards, blinds, ceilings, or even student or staff clothing. It's time for a check of our understanding on classroom materials during testing. Is it acceptable for a teacher to use his or her cell phone, her personal cell phone, to communicate with another teacher about a testing situation in the classroom? No, it's not acceptable. Teachers should not be using their personal cell phones for personal reasons or to communicate with other teachers during testing sessions. Is it acceptable to allow students to use their own approved calculators instead of one provided by the school? Yes, that is acceptable, provided that the teachers have checked to make sure that they meet the criteria for the calculator policy of the test being administered. Is it acceptable to allow students to read library or personal books as each student finishes and test materials are collected? Yes, that is acceptable, but it is a local decision made at each school or district, so you would need to speak with your BAC or DAC about that. All right, please read through your final questions the section on test preparation and student motivation and rewards. When you are planning activities that are linked to assessment, it's important to consider the instructional implications. In addition to the administration code, there are other regulations that apply to curriculum and instruction, so you'll need to follow those as well. In the months and weeks prior to testing, we should not discontinue our normal instruction. It's perfectly fine to review subject content material. Reviews are part of what we do normally in instruction, and continuing that is to be expected. However, our reviews should not take the place of routine instruction. If there is any question about the timing of content reviews, your lesson plans will serve as evidence that regular review has been part of instruction throughout the year. Once testing begins, we need to be extra careful. It's not acceptable to change your instructional schedule or to develop review lessons based on information you've gained from test booklets. For example, if you notice that a particular section on the math test appears to contain quite a few questions about fractions, it would not be acceptable to plan a review of fractions right before that test session. Students should be familiar with test-taking strategies, such as time management, double-checking answers, answering all parts of their extended response question, and so on. But these should be taught throughout the year on the classroom assessments, on district assessments, and not simply as preparation for state assessments. There are hundreds of test prep products available to teachers, and it's perfectly fine to use those products, as long as the results are used to improve your instruction and to identify students' strengths and weaknesses. Activities for the sole purpose of artificially raising test scores or test practice without providing feedback to students are not acceptable. Many districts and schools plan motivational activities and rewards for students during the state testing windows. Some use checklists to document and reward students' good faith effort on the test, and it's acceptable to use these kinds of checklists, but the expectations on the list should be general in nature, and they should not include any requirements that would take away student ownership. For example, the checklist could include things such as the student comes prepared for testing with pencils, or she arrives on time, he uses time wisely. But you would not want to include things like, she uses a Venn diagram to plan her extended responses, even if you've been using Venn diagrams all year. You wouldn't want to include that he writes at least 3 sentences on his extended responses. Again, telling students in any manner that you believe they're doing a good job on test responses is evaluative, and it interferes with a student's ownership of the work. If you do use a good faith effort checklist, it's expected that you would go over the contents of the checklist before testing starts, go over that with the parents, let the parents know what you're doing, so that students and parents know what you're looking for. But students should not be made aware of how they've done on that checklist until all testing is completed, and that includes makeup testing. It would not be acceptable to hold an assembly at the end of each day of testing, or to announce over the intercom each day which students or which classes have been doing a wonderful job on the state test today. It needs to wait until all testing has been completed. If your school chooses to reward students based on good faith effort checklist, it's very important that any funds that are used are checked against the Red Book rules. Your school bookkeeper will be able to provide guidance for you here. Unfortunately, at times, instead of providing a reward, it might be necessary to discipline a student for behavior during a testing session. Occasionally, a student might choose to be rebellious in her response by writing something such as, "I don't care," or "I'm not answering this dumb question." Or maybe he'll write or draw something inappropriate. When this happens, the school may instruct the student to answer the question again on a separate sheet of paper for disciplinary purposes. If you decide to do that, the student's original response should be sent in for scoring, and then you should send in the rewritten response to KDE, clearly marked, not to be scored, items retaken for disciplinary purposes. And then the rewritten responses should be handled as any other secure test materials. Okay, it's time for the final check of our understanding. Is it acceptable to announce on the intercom each day the results of the good faith effort checklist? No, it's not. This, again, remember, needs to wait until all testing has been administered. Then students can discover the results of their good faith effort checklist. Is it acceptable to let students know that they are doing a good job on test responses? No. Again, that is an evaluative comment. We don't want to we don't want to tell them they're doing a good or a poor job on their open response questions or any other questions that they're answering. It needs to be completely the work of the student. We don't want to know what adults can lead students to do. We want to know what students are able to do. Is it acceptable on a good faith effort checklist to require students to use a strategy they learned in class when answering test questions? No. Again, the good faith effort checklist should be general, and we cannot specify what kind of organizer a student is required to use. So now that we know how to administer state tests according to the administration code, what happens if we don't abide by it? Well, the administration code is a Kentucky administrative regulation. So besides jeopardizing the results we receive from state testing, there are also serious potential ramifications. When someone reports a violation of the administration code, we call it an allegation. Allegations can be reported by anyone, a teacher, parent, student, principal. They can be reported through notifying the school or district staff or directly to us here at KDE. They can be reported anonymously through phone calls or emails. And any reported allegations are filed under categories. Allegations reported to BACS should be relayed to KDE through DACS, who will then submit the information through an online secure web application. All test irregularities should be reported to your DAC or BAC. Not every test irregularity will be an allegation. There are degrees of impropriety. Irregularities that have a low-level risk of affecting student performance or test security can be corrected and contained at the local level. For example, a student becomes ill during a testing and the test administrator had to call for assistance. Well, that's an interruption of the assessment, but it's not an allegation. More serious irregularities should be reported as allegations as soon as possible after they occur. The more serious irregularities are those that have the possibility of affecting student scores or performance. Those would be things like student is cheating or a teacher's providing answers. Or those serious allegations might have the possibility of affecting test security, such as maybe a student took a photo of a test item and posted it to Instagram. Once an allegation has been reported, it is referred to our allegations coordinator. There must be sufficient enough information to warrant an investigation. And if the allegation does proceed to the investigation phase, the allegations coordinator might conduct interviews with any students and staff involved, either by phone or by visiting the school. After the investigation, the coordinator reports the findings to the Testing Board of Review, and they will make a recommendation to the commissioner. The recommendation could be required additional training, but more serious allegations could result in a recommendation for more serious consequences. It is our commissioner who will then make the final determination, and he will notify any of the staff members involved and also the district superintendent. We have just a few reminders before we go. The administration code does not cover all the training necessary for every situation. Anyone who will be involved in or potentially involved with providing accommodations during testing should also receive training in the inclusion of special populations. There are also additional trainings required for anyone administering alternate assessments. We've provided the link in the notes section of this PowerPoint to the alternate assessment training. Finally, the administration code specifies data reporting requirements. All non-academic information submitted to KDE is to be as accurate as possible at the time of submission. Purposely submitting incorrect data for the purpose of misrepresenting public reports is a serious violation. The administration code also requires us to follow KDE guidance on the release of different types of data throughout the school year by adhering to all embargoed dates. Congratulations! You have completed the administration code training. Don't forget to sign the signature page requested by your BAC. If you have any questions or need any support regarding state assessment, your first line of contact is your BAC or DAC. But you may also call or email any of us here in the Office of Assessment and Accountability, Division of Assessment Support.